I am John. I am currently the CTO and one of the co-founders of LaunchDarkly, which is a 300-person company at this point, based out of Oakland, and now a little bit more distributed than we had been previously. Before that, I was at Atlassian. I was at Atlassian for about 6 years. I joined when they were about 150 people and left at about 2,500 people. So I lived through that sort of like stage of growth at Atlassian. And then prior to that, I did a PhD in programming languages and type systems and stuff at Berkeley. Jesper?
Thanks, John. Hey, everyone. My name is Jesper Joergensen. I'm right now with Twilio. I've been here for 3.5 years, and I've seen Twilio go through growth from about 1,000 people when I joined in 2018 to about 5,000 people right now. So that by itself has been a wild ride. I spent almost 10 years at Salesforce and more specifically Heroku. Most of the time that was at Heroku. And before that, I was at BEA Systems, if anybody remember them, Java Application Server back in the 2000s. So my entire career has been very much around developer platforms, with pretty strong focus on enterprise developers and that boundary between startup developers and enterprise developers, especially at Heroku.
Cool. So I'll kick it off with a topic of conversation that Jesper and I were talking about yesterday. So Jesper was mentioning yesterday in our conversation that something that was top of mind for him was like this evolution into something that we were calling like sort of like steady state, or like the transition from a team that's operating sort of like ignite the rocket engine versus like flying it kind of continuously, to abuse a metaphor. Jesper, I was hoping you could like talk a little bit about that, like what you're seeing and how it impacts a team.
Yeah, it was something that, you and I had a good conversation yesterday, and before that, Ted and I were talking about it as well. And one of the observations I've had over the years has been that, especially from, let's say, like 2008 and forward, we've all startups have really embraced this like be an owner mentality, and you own it, you operate it. So you go in, you set up a startup, you start with like one team, then you add a few more teams, right? And you follow this mentality of, we're going to write code, we're going to own the code, and we're going to operate the code, and we're going to move really fast, right? And then the problem is that at some point, if you become successful, so if you don't become successful, it's great, right? You don't have to worry.
Doesn't matter.
But if you become successful, and like one way you can talk about the steady state is really when you get customers, and those customers start using your services. In many cases, the moment that happens, it's already written for the future that your service will be around for longer than any one of the engineers that are working on it at that point in time. And the thing is, that was actually not how you started. You started with the engineers that are living and breathing the code and knowing every nook and cranny of the code, and documentation and maintainability and sustainability and trainability were second thoughts, as they should be. And the thought that I had there was, how do you ensure that you transition at the right point? Because if you don't, then debt will just start accruing from that point going forward. You lose your first engineer, you have to train your first new engineer. Maybe that'll be fine, right? It's just one person has to learn all this stuff, but that'll soon escalate. And the harder it is for you to sustain a flow of people through your team with a single service, the more you'll start grinding to a halt and having issues. And then that gets exacerbated by microservices, where you're not just having one app that you're projecting to your customers. You're having dozens and dozens of these mini products within your organization that all have at least implicit, hopefully explicit interfaces and promises that they're making to other teams in your organization. And then this stuff can really start like grinding you to a halt if you don't get ahead of it.
One of my first like sort of questions on that from you, as you've been through this so many times, is like, when you think like the first indications are that you should start investing in that, like the practices of like sustaining a service or something? Like, is it when your first customer comes on board, or is it a little bit later than that? Because like I think when your first customer comes on board, you're still not assured of success, and you're just trying to move super fast and like throw things over the wall, and you're not investing in the like service catalogs and documentation and like how do I reduce the bus factor here, because you just don't even have the headcount to support that. So when do you think is like a natural place to start going, okay, now we need to start investing in the long term here?
Yeah, that's obviously a really difficult question. In those early days, days matter, right? And what you spend your days on can make or break. If you take the eye off the ball and don't focus on feature development and then moving your product forward. So this is a very difficult question to answer. It's probably not the first customer. You probably need a little bit more momentum before you do it. But I will say that one thing you can do for yourself, even before you start actually putting work towards it, is to try to manage your culture. Because what you want to do is you want to make sure that you will embrace doing it when it's time to do it. Another problem that often happens in startups is that you build your culture around the things you don't need initially. So you build sort of a culture to define all the things you don't need. So you can build a culture around we don't need sales. You can build a culture around we don't need QA, or we don't need project management. And you can build a culture around we don't need to write code comments, because the people who own the code are the people who wrote the code and they understand it, right? I'm not saying anybody does that sort of consciously, but just think about that, right? If you start with a culture that says, well, one day we'll have to do that, it becomes easier to do it the day it's necessary, and you won't resist it. So at least doing that and being aware of, what are the things we're not doing right now that we will have to start doing at some point. I think even the awareness of that is actually a great place to start.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think about is sort of like there's a when we had this conversation yesterday, it brought to my mind this idea of like there are things that are like reasonable, sort of like sacred cows to have, like reasonable things that are like, okay, this won't ever change, and those tend to be like more cultural things, like we value the idea of like continuously shipping and keeping master green so that we can always deploy. Like we're gonna maintain that forever, versus things that like could change as the company evolves.
Right.
And so this idea of like we're gonna build our culture around like we don't have salespeople, like that definitely resonated with me, because that was like at Atlassian, that was like one of the things in the early days, and like lo and behold they have salespeople now, and that was like a hard shift for them. So I like that idea of sort of like saying like, okay, here are the things that are like we're really going to be intentional about. These really are a part of our culture, versus like things that need to be revisited almost like on an annual basis at a startup. And one of those is like the we don't have salespeople, or like we don't have QA even, or like we don't have project managers, don't necessarily seem like great things, because like once you have those people, they're going to start reading the old documents,
Right.
and reading all of the blog posts about how you were so proud to not ever need project managers because they're so wasteful. And then like the first project manager comes in and is like, what am I doing here?
And in a way, we started talking about LaunchDarkly was that as we think about how teams mature up, and then the notion of feature flags and using feature flags to deploy continuously is very I would say fairly well ingrained, at least as a concept right now. But then we were talking about a company like LaunchDarkly, how when you build that as a service, like what kind of insights you get into how all these teams out there who are starting early, then building up, and then adding feature flagging at some point, how you get insights into their progression and their maturation. And I was really curious, how that, like how you've seen that, and like how you've been able to incorporate that into your product and your roadmap.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one of the things I love about building developer tools is
Right.
like from your own customers, you get to see like sort of like everything. And I've like you, I've been in sort of like this space for basically my entire career. And so you always kind of get that, like you get to look at your customers, and when you have when you're at a company like Heroku, like Twilio, where your customer base goes from tiny startups to like Fortune 100, Fortune 20 even, you get to sort of like see the gamut, like you get to see everything in terms of like how people develop software. And we have that at LaunchDarkly now. And one of the things that we've been able to see is sort of like at organizations, we've been able to see how feature flag adoption has gone from like a company that's never done it before to like gone to rely on it. And then we've even seen the bad side of that, because like feature flags can be misused and abused. And so like we've also gotten a good deal of insight into like what goes wrong, like what happens when you use feature flags and like don't clean up after yourself, or what happens when you have no best practices and people are using feature flags as a crutch for like everything. And so that's been really interesting to see. You know, it's a thing that you can use to sort of like directly inform your product. So for example, like we've invested a lot in LaunchDarkly on functionality to help you reduce technical debt. Because I mean, honestly, even us dogfooding our own product, we've gotten into a state sometimes where we have like flags that like, hey, I don't know who owns this. Like, I don't know what this flag does. It's been rolled out to like everybody for 8 months. Or we even had a situation where we're like, we built something and it was supposed to be turned on for everybody and we just forgot to turn it on for everybody. So it was like 20% of the customer base had the flag enabled and it was just sitting there for like weeks at 20%. So we've seen the good and we've seen the bad. It's really been valuable in terms of like informing what we try to build and how we try to adapt to get everybody to a state of like adopting feature flags and being in a good place with it.
Yeah, it's one of the areas of debt that I've seen sneak up on people because you tend to think about feature flags as a good thing for a long time. You're like really proud. You're like, we're using feature flags, it's amazing. We can deploy code without breaking customers, and then we can just flag them in afterwards. This is really cool. And then it's a little bit further down the line that you have the feature flag sprawl. And you really have 100 different behaviors of your own product because it all depends on like what the flag combinations are set to.
Yeah.
You start realizing that you have a problem. What have you seen amongst both yourself and your customer base? What are some of the most excellent practices that you've seen teams exhibit in order to keep that under control? Whether you've turned it into a feature in your product or not, you can tell me that. But what would you say is like, this team figured it out. This team instilled a certain process or practice that solved for that.
Yeah, and I love that question too. I would say it's been there's been a bunch of sort of like process things that teams that have done this well have adopted. One of them is pushing the flagging concern into like the planning phase, being deliberate about like what flags are being introduced and what the use case is. So for example, like at companies that have adopted this really well, it's a planning concern where the PM and the engineers are like, do we leverage feature flags in this project? And if so, what are we trying to get out of them? And so that could be like, we're running an experiment and we want to measure the impact of this feature on a specific KPI or metric. And so we're going to flag it so we can create a control and experiment group. That's like one of the things that we've seen. Another thing that we've seen is sort of like a deliberate cleanup process is incredibly important. And that actually requires work. I think like one of the things we talked about is sort of like, hey, there's like the adoption of like modern delivery practices, some of the new things that teams are doing now, feature flags being one of them. But when I look at each of these things, there's always like a way that they can be abused. Like there's always like a bad state of them. And knowing that and knowing that you need to like invest to avoid that, I think is incredibly important. Like a great example is like continuous integration, right? Like 10 years ago, continuous integration wasn't like ubiquitous. It wasn't something that everybody did. But the bad version of continuous integration is like a test suite that takes 24 hours to run. And now everything is blocked, waiting for the 24-hour test suite to turn green. And so you have to invest. The bad state of feature management or feature flagging is I've got 3,000 flags. 2,500 of them are active. 500 of them have been introduced and we have no idea what they do, but they're not being called anymore. We don't even know where they are in the code base. And there's 2,500 of them, and some of them are mission critical, and we don't have any idea like how to clean them up, and we don't have anybody maintaining them. That's what bad looks like, and kind of like one of our objectives in building LaunchDarkly is like, what are all the things that we can do to prevent you from getting into that bad state? Because we know that left unchecked, you are going to get into that bad state.
I was going to say, any cool features that you feel like you put into the product that helps with that?
Yeah, no, definitely. So one of them, we actually launched at GitHub Universe a couple years back, and it's just like we just find references to feature flags in your code base and then show them in one place, and that's really useful.
Yeah,
I think more broadly speaking, like we're introducing more and more in like around the life cycle management of a feature flag. So like what fraction of people are getting this, and then which ones are like inactive, which ones can be removed from the dashboard. And then moving that into sort of like a workflow of like, here's all the things that you should look at. Here's what you need to do to get them out of your code base. I almost feel like at some point people are going to ask for like a Kanban style thing of like, you can only have this many flags in prod, and we're not going to let you create more because we don't want to let you shoot yourself in the foot. So to introduce another one, you're going to have to close one out. Like that seems like an inevitability to me.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize that the value of software is that it's homogeneous. Like you have many customers that's using one thing, and every time you add yet another feature flag, and you add another combination use of your product, you're diluting the value of your software. If you have 10,000 customers that are using it in 1,000 different ways, do you really have a piece of software?
Yeah.
Really have a product, right? And then people think, well, it's just like a bunch of flags set in different ways, but it actually ends up being 1,000 different experiences by your 10,000 customers. And that'll start eroding the value.
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think that there's like a counterpoint to that, which is like, are there ways in which product experiences need to be more tailored towards specific audiences? Maybe not as much in the B2B space, but in sort of like in B2C, you think about like things like personalization, delivering different product experiences to different consumers and the value that that provides. And I think there's a world in which, like in the B2B SaaS world, right? Like if that turns into a sprawling code base with like a million factorial combinations of different product features, that's a bad thing. In the B2C space, it could just be like a business need to do that. I guess one anti-pattern that I see there is like, are you introducing a feature flag because your product team can't make an opinionated decision about how something should be built, and so you're just going to have it both ways by flagging it? Or are you actually delivering a unique experience that needs to be there? Or, is this just like a rollout thing where you need to retire it right after? And I see kind of like feature flags being used for all of those different things.
Yeah, I've seen them, especially in B2B. They're being used when you're lazy and you don't want to build an actual configuration option for the customer.
Yeah.
So you're talking about personalization, right? Like there's obviously most products have like some admin interface, some admin panel and settings panel. You go in, you can turn, do you want like this or that, right? And every time you do that and you give it to the customer, you realize that you are creating permutations of your product that all have to be tested. But if you do it that way, you're sort of being honest to yourself about the actual set of combinations you're creating, and you're a little bit more incentivized or a little bit more likely to go test it properly and so on. That's why what an anti-pattern I've seen is teams will go like, well, we'll just have a feature flag for that, and they'll file a support ticket, and somebody will flip the flag, right? And then they'll have a different behavior, which is a bad customer experience. But it also means you probably aren't properly testing all sides of it, and it also means that there's not full visibility across your entire population, like your customers, salespeople, support people, everyone, that this combination exists. So now it's not out in the public docs, right? And becomes a little bit more hidden. And so it's eventually going to sneak up and surprise you at some future time.
Yeah, I think that's one of the value propositions we provide is sort of like when people that have built their own feature flagging system come to us, sometimes they're like, we have feature flagging. It's like it's a bit in the database, or like it's a hash table or something like this. And it's sort of like, that's great, but like, are you recognizing the sort of like downstream implications of different experiences being delivered to different people? Like, how is your support team is not going to have visibility into that database configuration, bit that's on the account level that you're using for feature flagging. So when they get a support ticket, how are they going to understand what variant of the product experience has been delivered to that customer, and how can they react to it? And that tends to be like an aha moment for teams that are like, oh, I get it. Okay, so it's an infrastructure, it's a piece of infrastructure that you can use to deliver different product experiences, but it's also, there's like this collaboration layer that needs to exist that the product has to provide. Otherwise, all the downstream, like the wake that's generated from different flags being on for different people, doesn't really get understood or doesn't really get accounted for.
Going back to like this difference between ignition and sort of, control burn, LaunchDarkly is definitely past the ignition stage at this point. So it'd be interesting to hear from you, like in your engineering organization, what are the sets of activities or things you feel like you do for a given team, for a given part of your code base or the whole code base that is making it easier for you to accept churn, to offer a consistent product while engineers join your teams, leave your teams, or other engineers join? What are some of the top practices that you put in place there?
I think candidly, I have to say, like, it kind of snuck up on us. We got to a point, like, you always want to be able to anticipate what's coming next. And like, I don't think we adequately like anticipated the sort of steady state. And we're like deliberately feeling it this year. We've onboarded, like, we basically doubled our engineering team in size. And we realized that things that were just sort of like tacit knowledge for a group of people, they weren't documented, and there were just certain behaviors that we expected everyone to operate under. Like I mentioned in our conversation the other day, like daily stand-ups, right? Like we never wrote down that every team was expected to have daily stand-ups, because we just assumed, like, hey, we've been doing this, and like as we've grown in new teams, at least somebody that's been at LaunchDarkly for a while that has gone through the ritual of a daily stand-up will say, like, hey, shouldn't we have a daily stand-up for this team? And we found new teams that were like, wait, we have daily stand-up. Wait, we're using a tool for that? Oh, and we of course had done the thing of like automating things. So like we did daily stand-ups through this tool called Geekbot, which was all driven through Slack. And we actually tied some of the responses to some of the metrics that we were tracking, like specifically like how much time are we spending on keeping lights on KTLO versus new. And so when squads weren't using that same mechanism, we just had like missing data for their teams. To your question, I'd say like writing, I mean, effectively, it all comes down to like writing down what it is that you're doing, how you're expecting teams to behave, and like what norms there are, to sort of like reduce the bust factor, and onboard people more quickly, more rapidly, and get them up to speed as quickly as possible. And it's been hard. I mean, there's a lot of like, I think engineers, when they sit down, like there are very few engineers that like want to sit down at the start of their day and say, like, I think I'm going to write down everything that I do, right? It's hard. It's a hard pill to swallow, or it's hard to sell to teams sometimes. Specifically, like one of the things that we've done recently that I think has been really helpful is we defined this document called product principles. And it's sort of like because unlike Twilio, we basically have like one code base and one product. So I'm sure I'd love to hear how things differ at Twilio. But one of the things we defined is sort of like, here's how the product should operate. Here's like a mental model of the product. And as you extend the product, unless there's a damn good reason, like it should follow this mental model. So, and this is like really tactical, hands-on stuff. So for example, like when we create a new entity in LaunchDarkly, and an entity can be like, I don't know, like a new piece of, something new in our data model, or like, for like a feature flag or an environment or a project or things like that. When you create a new entity in LaunchDarkly, it should be versioned. There should be an audit trail that's visible to customers. It should have a REST API. It should work with our role-based access control system. And so we wrote down all of those rules, so that when an engineer comes onto the team and is starting to like build new functionality on top of LaunchDarkly, it feels the same as the rest of LaunchDarkly, because it works in a certain way and the REST API interacts a certain way. We sort of thought of it like it's sort of like defining the rules of physics in the product. And if you can define the rules of physics in the product, then like somebody that's interacting with your product can like feel comfortable like interacting with a new part of the product, because it like the same rules apply. Like gravity works one way here, and it should work the same way over here. And so that was one of the things that we just rolled out recently that I think I'm hoping is going to have a pretty big impact. I'm curious, like, in the world of Twilio, where things are a little more, it sounds like heterogeneous in terms of like the products and the teams building them. Like, are there things like that are sort of like common unifying factors?
Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting difference, and I think people listening in maybe in one or the other boat here. The difference between having an engineering organization and sort of a product that's defined by mostly one code base or one repo versus many, and both at Twilio and Heroku, it's distributed, so there's just lots and lots of code bases. And it sounds like in your case it's a little bit different. But it's interesting. It's not necessarily a matter of size of what you're building, right? It's interesting in that in places like Google, they're really trying to like drive things through a monorepo and through a little like more rigor around that. But both Heroku and Twilio has had like a fairly similar culture around this, and it means that it makes it easier for you to start to build a new service and pick new technologies and sort of be free. But it also means that you can't sort of write a file inside a repo that describes how to contribute, so to speak, right? Because the contributions are all over the map. And so I like what you're doing with principles. I think that's one way of trying to do something that's a little bit more global. And we've definitely had discussions in both my jobs here about just how rigorous, how much consistency we want to impose. And what I've taken away from that, sort of specifically commenting on this model where it's distributed, where you have many different repos, I found that comparing like taking a page from something like open source has been helpful. So if you go look at any good, fairly successful open source project, it does a repo in GitHub somewhere, right? And the authors of a project like that is forced to really document it in a way that assumes that any random person might want to come and contribute. So they really have the extreme version of not being able to impose anything on anybody, at least impose anything in terms of who's going to come and be interested. Like once they engage and want to contribute, then they can impose the policies, right? But before that even happens, they'll have to make the documentation and information about the project rich enough that people feel compelled to contribute. So I take a page from that, and we've encouraged people to think about their code bases in that way, right? So not just if you're hiring somebody that comes into your team, but also if you want to encourage what we call guest engineering. So somebody from another team will come and actually contribute code to your code base. What is the documentation that is needed there? Another thing that I found, and this is specifically when you start having microservices and you have a lot of services that are internal facing, it's very easy to not be as disciplined about those services as you would be your products. Like for LaunchDarkly, I can go to your website and read the documentation about how to use it, including API documentation, the developer-facing documentation, right? And I'm really reading the user docs there, right? If you have an internal service, what I've seen is that user docs can easily get mixed up with system docs. Like, so the documentation about like how we're running this service is sort of mixed in with how would you use this service. And that's sort of a first place to start, to separate it into those two buckets, because then you can better judge the quality independently. So you can look at, is this service easy to use? Like, have we actually documented how you might use it? Well, that's one question you want to answer. But then to provide a continuity in terms of your team, it's the other question you want to answer, right? Is this service easy to understand? Can somebody come in and actually operate this service, make changes to this service? What would we need to document in order to make that happen? So that's sort of been sort of the first thing to, that we've been focusing on and sort of evaluating. Then another thing that we've also spent some time on is to think about tests, not just as prevent things from breaking when we deploy, but also as documentation of what the service is supposed to do. It's been really encouraging when we, when we see developers invest in writing tests and they come back and say, this is going to make it much easier for the next person to understand this. I wish this was here when I got here.
I'm curious if the like the motivation, the motivational tactic of like allow other people to contribute is enough of a motivation to get people to engage in those behaviors, to write great documentation on how to work on the service or how to contribute to it and how to run it? Or are there other forcing functions that you have to apply to get the teams to do that kind of work?
Yeah, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think you can do a lot of different things there, but at the end of the day, building it into your culture early on is going to be the most impactful thing you can do. So build it into your culture that, you document something that, like the Ralph Waldo Emerson quote ish is like, you leave the world in a better place than you found it. That you take a code base and you think of it as, just an objectively good thing to do.
Mhm.
Is as you learn, you document, and then the person after you won't have to learn the same thing all over again. And interestingly, that's something that should be ingrained in anybody who has, has been learning science, the scientific method, has been studying engineering. And I mean, a lot of the learning and studying that many of the people in the computer industry have done and should really entice that kind of behavior. So I think it's just a matter of, not it's a matter of encouraging it with culture. I think that's a big part of it. So similar to how you don't want a culture that says sales is not for us, you also, want to early on talk about, how these things are valuable, even if we're not doing them yet, right? It's easier to tell yourself, we should be doing it. We're not doing it yet. We'll get to it, rather than give yourself the excuses saying the reason why we're not doing it is because we don't do that stuff around here.
Yeah.
Give yourself a rationale for not doing it, then that's going to stick. And then when it is time to really prioritize it, then you're going to continue to not do it because now you build sort of an excuse into your culture.
Yeah. I think if I had to go back and shift anything about our culture here, it would be to bring in like the idea of writing as an important part of the culture from the earliest stages. Because like, there's a number of great companies. There's so many templates of great companies that have keyed themselves off of that, like Stripe and Amazon. And one of the things that we've discovered is like, it is really hard to retrofit that into a culture that didn't have it in before, because you don't hire for it, you don't test for it as a competency really, like in the staff in hiring, but then just like there isn't this established baseline of like, here's what our expectations are around like what you write and how you communicate information in a written way. And so there isn't like, it tends to just feed off that, right? Like it's really hard to reboot that or change the direction of the company once that hasn't been established. And yeah, if I ever started another company, I think that's one of the things that I would change from day one, is sort of establish a bit more of that, because it's just so valuable in so many different contexts.
Yeah, at Heroku, we used to talk about README driven development, doc-driven development, and that's obviously something other companies out there are doing. I find that there are two things about documentation that are important. One is when you work backwards from documentation, it's just a great way of building something. It's sort of just a shorthand for forcing yourself to understanding your users, especially if obviously if it's the user documentation. The other thing that I think is important is that it becomes a check. Like one of the problems I've seen is you write code and the code exhibits a certain behavior, and now you have a user and the user starts using your service. Now the question is it behaving correctly or not? And we're not talking about big bugs, right? We could be talking about like, should it be using single quotes or double quotes for, formatting JSON strings or whatnot, right?
Right.
But it behaves in a certain way, and somebody starts relying on the behavior, and then later on you find you have a debate about, well, it wasn't really supposed to behave in that way, so I changed it, and then I broke my customer. Or the other way around, the customer says you can't change it, and well, I expected it to behave in this way. Having documentation gives you the third leg of that stool, right? So you can have in the documentation that it explains how it's supposed to work, and then that if you wrote in your docs that it's supposed to work a certain way and the service actually does not work that way, then it's easy, right? Then it's a bug and you'll go fix the service. Now it can also happen that you have a dog bug, right? Where, the service is actually behaving as it should, but is not documented correctly. But holding yourself to the standard of then fixing that and then getting it documented correctly is very valuable, I find. And it just increases trust with your user, whether that's an internal or external user. This might be, a motherhood and apple pie, but it's just, and then this is why I like to think about documentation as code, right? And that's also something that I see is being practiced more and more out there, where you have documentation checked into a repo, maybe the same repo as your code base, and you can go do a pull request on it and say, we want to update, how this is supposed to work. And you can actually, express that through a change to the documentation. And if you accept that pull request, now you now have a delta between how it actually works and how it's supposed to work. And then you can go and either do all that in one pull request or do that in a subsequent one. And you can have that workflow, and you can have that audit trail afterwards. Or, you know, it was back in like 1999, we actually changed how it was supposed to work. You can tell, here's the commit where we did that.
Yeah. I love that. We did that to our docs. We open sourced our documentation as a Git repo. Yep. And you can submit pull requests. You can also go into our Gatsby site and sort of like suggest edits. Yep. And you don't get a ton of contribution that way, but the fact that you can, like the fact that it's, you know, backed by Git, and you can go back and look at the documentation circa, yeah. 2019 or something like that is super valuable.
I love it. And you hold yourself publicly accountable that way, right? Like if you ever have a support ticket from a customer, and I've been through these, that says like, I swear it used to not work this way. What did you change? And then inside your company, especially as you grow bigger and bigger, like that's the support engineer that's answering the request is like, well, I looked through the docs, and it is supposed to work that way. And the customer goes like, those docs changed, I swear. And the support engineer is like, I don't know, like we don't really.
Yeah.
Being able to go back, it's like,
check out our docs from committed, in 2019 when you thought it worked the other way, and like it says the same thing, and it's much better than like go into the Wayback Machine and see what the docs look like in 2019. Shifting back, one of the things we talked about is like sort of like when is it appropriate to, the topic we were talking about earlier is when is it appropriate to sort of invest in, in going into the steady state. Tangentially from that, I have this question for you, which is like, when does it become appropriate to start investing in sort of like shared infrastructure and productivity internally? Like a concrete example of this is at some point in the scale of a company, you start building internal tooling, you might even have like a developer productivity tool or a team of people who are tasked with making everybody else more productive. They don't build anything for the customer, but they're developers. They're building infrastructure for the developers within the company. When does that happen in your opinion? Like when is an appropriate stage for that versus like a premature optimization consideration?
Yeah, that is a huge question, right? And you'll see different companies. If you look at sort of the big companies out there today, you'll see that you sort of that the cultures drive them in different direction. Like some will like resist it, and some will like rely a lot on it. You have a company like Microsoft was a platform to begin with, and so has sort of like platform in its lifeblood. You have a company like Amazon that is in a weird way not a platform company, in that it's all about building value for customers all the time, but then they've taken that cultural value and used it to make them good at building products for themselves as well, which then become platform products. And I think that, and you have companies who set out to become really good at building products. Like if we build product number one, like if we get good at building products, then we can build product number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and then that's how we're going to really grow, right? But I think it's important there to realize, like, if you really want to do that, you have to really silo it and treat it as, well, that's a product end to end. It's like it has its own market, its own product, its own technology stack, then you can kind of really do it. I think a more common scenario is, as a company, you build product number 1 and then product number 2, and then you sort of start distilling something out of it. And realizing that there's sort of you're building a secret sauce, and you're distilling that into a platform that then becomes a competitive advantage. That's probably the most common way to sort of strategically think about why you would want to build a platform. So the when follows that. Like when you start feeling like you have something you can extract, that would be one way to make that decision. Now, there are other ways to think about this decision. I would say in the software world we live in, I would say most companies and teams that I've seen are probably not as focused on automation at the next layer out as they should be. it always comes a little bit too late, and you always end up doing a little bit too much manual work. Yeah, I was going to ask you with LaunchDarkly, because I know you told me you're running multiple instances, right? So sometimes people think about platform as something like big and shiny, but platform can just be, or common tooling can just be, how do you deploy different instances in a way that's fairly automated, and you don't really have to do a lot of work. So that's a great example, right, of where if you went and addressed a new market opportunity by deploying LaunchDarkly one more time, but it's totally manual, like every deployment is kind of hand cranking it. Now you have two of them. At that point, you probably should automate already. And but you do, of course, have to justify. So you do have to think about, like, is this a pattern that's going to continue? Like, are we just going to have two forever? But even if you're only going to have two forever, you probably should still automate it. I would say that being able to do meta programming, as I would call it, like step away from where you are, step out one layer from where you are right now, and look at the things you considered manual tasks and start automating them is an important thought process. And that's one way you can platformize. It's not the only way, but that's one way you start building actual code that customers don't see, but that help you run your systems.
Yeah, I love that, because like I think when a lot of people think about the platformizing step, they're primarily thinking about it in terms of like toil at times, like how much developer effort is it costing to deploy, and so we can make everybody more productive. But I like this idea of like thinking about it in terms of like, okay, if you're eventually going to grow inorganically by acquiring somebody else or building a second product, then the abstraction piece of that becomes a strategic, or like a competitive advantage that you can apply. So I love that lens of it as just not just in terms of like improving developer productivity, but also providing a competitive advantage in the marketplace by providing you a set of abstract components or tools or code or processes that you can then reuse to get you to a second product or a second opportunity faster. It's a cool insight.
There's another classic kind of reason, or what people will call platform, to invest in, and that is customization and building an ecosystem around your product, right? So putting in APIs so that your customers can customize your product, but also so that partners and third parties can integrate into your product. That's a place where the word platform is being used a lot as well. And again, I think all this just sums up to platform is an overloaded term, and you have to start by knowing which one of these are you really is it really about, is what you're talking about right now. And then based on it, once you've answered that question, you can figure out what is now the time and what's the ROI. LaunchDarkly, you started with smaller customers, right? But at this point, you're working with enterprises. So have you found, and I think of you as a product-led company, that you ship frequently, your customers love that generally. But as you moved into enterprise, have you found that the way that you deliver product has had to change?
I think in some of the earlier days of LaunchDarkly, there wasn't this tension between the things that we would have to build for enterprises and the things that we would have to build for smaller customers. And I think a piece of that, or a good chunk of it, was a function of us being in the sort of like category creation mode, where we were like a new capability that people didn't really have except through like homegrown systems that frankly, like for the most part, weren't very good. And so that meant that a lot of like the basic functionality that we had to provide for people was stuff that would be valuable not only for like large enterprises, but also small customers. Even today, I think we aren't often, when we're thinking about making a product decision, a decision to build something, we do map that to personas and, enterprise versus non-enterprise. But it's often the case that even for the enterprise grade functionality that we're building, I think one of the realities that we point to a lot of times is like software teams are kind of fractal. So a small organization might have like one engineering team. As that company gets larger, it might scale out into multiple engineering teams with a layer of management on top of it, and it'll grow sort of like fractally from there. And we're seeing that more and more as an organizational model that even larger enterprises are following. And that means that we can build functionality that works for smaller teams. And a lot of times that will work fine at a larger enterprise, as long as we're thinking about how that maps to sort of like the fractal adoption of that feature, right? All that said, like there's still stuff that, like, you know, when you build fractally, like it doesn't make sense for the smallest unit. Like, so for example, like enterprise administration delegation, like that's not something that a small startup is really going to get a ton of value out of, but it's a persona at a Fortune 100 company that you need to build for, and a set of functionality that's helpful for them that you have to tackle. But we're still, I would say, like overall, we're still in a state where like greater than 50% of the functionality that we're building is stuff that's applicable to, you know, almost anyone, which is kind of a cool space to be in. It avoids that sort of like tension between, are you investing enough in building for enterprise versus are you trying to go for the product-led growth motion and build for customers at scale?
What about the delivery model or the sort of delivery cadence? Have you found that enterprises don't like, you keep changing your product and they actually don't like that, and they'd like to have a little bit more fixed version of your product? And you've had to think about different, you know, rollout or release mechanisms?
Yeah, you know, that I think that's one that I had definitely seen a bunch at Atlassian, where you know, at Atlassian, when they shifted into cloud, there were enterprises using their cloud offerings that moved from hosting their own Jira or Confluence, for example, to moving to the cloud model and accepting constant change, and hitting a lot of struggle with that. Like, I remember we at Atlassian, they used to release on Sundays, and so Monday, teams would come in and say, like, what's fresh in my Jira instance? What fresh hell am I in for today? And I know that was, you know, something that you experienced a bit at Salesforce as well. You know, we hear a little bit of that at LaunchDarkly, not a ton of it. I wonder whether it's a function of sort of like companies becoming more accepting of sort of like the cloud-based delivery models,
Right.
or whether cloud-based, you know, continuous delivery needs to adapt the other way and be more accepting of like hesitance around change being deployed in enterprise software. I think it's probably a little bit of push and pull. But one thing I will say is that even with enterprise customers that are accepting of like rapid change that you would get from like a fast-moving startup like us, what they do want better visibility around change. So like, let us know what's happening and let us know in advance if you can when something is going to happen, so they can map that to their ability to manage it on their end.
Yeah, that is so true. And I think, as you say, it's really important for smaller companies to know the difference between something enterprises don't like because they're in the middle of a transition versus something they don't like or they want in a certain way because it's a completely valid like request, and you just have not really been used to dealing with enterprises. It's just I find it really important to be humble and listening there. But the hard part is you can't like flip all the way over and go, you know, tell me everything you need and then I'll go give it to you. So that's a fine balance to strike. I was also just thinking, like, specifically in the case of LaunchDarkly, even within enterprises, your customers are probably very developer oriented. This is my assumption. One of my experiences from Salesforce was that you know, Salesforce early on had this concept of do not auto enable, and still have it, and so Salesforce, the end user of Salesforce is salespeople, was salespeople way back in the time, right, when it was just SFA. And then every company had an administrator that you know, sort of like owned the experience of these salespeople, and it was very important for us to deliver the capabilities to the administrator and let the administrator roll them out to the actual end users. And that led to this notion that, like, you know, I see it every now and then on Twitter, that you just referred to, that when Salesforce comes out with its release notes, you know, 3 times a year, it's like a 1,000-page document, and the administrators actually really like reading it because it is, what are all the like candy they're going to get, what are all the great things they're going to get, all the answers to past problems that has now been delivered to them, and then it becomes their job to roll it out to their customers, which they're really good at and proud of. Those are some things that definitely are different in terms of delivering to enterprises compared to if I think about what we were doing at Heroku startups in the early.
Yeah, and I love the idea of one of the things that you mentioned at Salesforce is like the idea of like having the administrator persona be somebody that you target deliberately. You have product managers that are servicing that persona. That's so incredibly valuable, especially if you're, like almost anyone building a developer tool, at some point you're going to sell to the enterprise. And if you want to sell to the enterprise, like understanding that there is a person using your product that doesn't give a crap about feature flags. All they care about is rolling out that tool because somebody has told them that it's valuable for whatever reason. They want to roll that tool out to their entire organization and make sure that from a compliance perspective, everything is buttoned up. From a control perspective, they're able to do what they need. They can audit changes. They can add and remove administrators. They can do administration delegation to different team members. All of that. There's so much that you have to build in your product to service that persona. And if you're not thinking about that persona, you're gonna struggle selling to a company with 1,000 developers, or 5,000 developers, or 50,000 team members within the organization.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't really feel like we have any excuses anymore. I think that's changed over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I think we had a wave of SaaS products being available, and it was unclear whether like how enterprises were going to adopt them. And the people who built those products were learning at the time what enterprises needed, what large organizations needed. But that's no longer the case. Like we have that knowledge now. And I think we have seen a lot of, I feel like I've seen a lot of startups build new SaaS products targeted at B2B SaaS products that very early on have some of these basic enterprise features. SSO is the obvious one, right? But organizations, teams, like management structures within the product that helps an enterprise or a large organization, like you said yourself, sort of grows fractally, gives them the management constructs that they need.
Yeah, it's becoming cheaper to build that functionality. Like not only is it becoming more well known what you need to sell, but it's becoming cheaper to build it. There are more SaaS offerings that help you get to that point. Like take compliance as an example. When we started, I remember we were selling to an enterprise customer early in the days of LaunchDarkly, and they asked us if we were SOC 2 compliant. And I had no, like I'm going to admit, I had no idea what SOC 2 compliance was at that point in time. And I was like hemming and hawing, like, I don't know, I think we could do it pretty quickly. Like we focus a lot on security here. We could probably get there pretty quickly. And then the person on the other side is like, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious you don't know what you're talking about because, SOC 2 is relatively difficult for one thing, and then it requires 6 months of continuous operation to get your type 2. So, you're clearly making this up because you don't. And so, that was the world back then. And nowadays you look and it's like seed stage startups through, better tooling and just more mature engineering capabilities, getting those kind of like compliance things out of the way. But that compliance is just one example. It's sort of just like, across the spectrum, like role-based access controls, audit logging, these things are like more, it's well known that you need to have them, and it's becoming easier and easier to not only like justify the investment in doing them early on, but also to just execute and build on them. A few different dimensions. I think one of them, as you pointed out, like the shift into more remote and hybrid. I think there's going to be a bit of a snapback for a time. I think people think that this hybrid model is going to be easy and they'll just roll into it. And once people start rolling back into the office, people are going to start realizing just how challenging it is to support, a meeting where 10 people are in a room and 10 people are remote. That's actually really difficult to do. And so there's going to be a bit of a snapback. I'm not sure how people are going to adapt to that, but I think that that's a reality that we're going to have to sort out. Another thing that I think about is sort of like, I talked about this model, this fractal model of like software teams. I think we see this more and more with teams becoming more and more integrated in how they how they operate continuously. So like, there's from a development side, like the idea of continuous delivery and how it impacts how developers do their job is relatively obvious. The DevOps movement. Now there's this idea of like, let's throw security into the mix and have them operate continuously. So now we have DevSecOps, and it's like, but wait, PMs should be able to get into the game too. So like, should we have like DevSec PM ops? Like, is that a thing? And then it's like, well, what about designers? And like, I think the reality that we're moving to is like this sort of like continuous operation model where we have like rapid small batch change, operating continuously, using tools to create faster feedback loops. I see that becoming a discipline that's embraced across all the facets of software delivery beyond just like the dev teams, the ops teams. I think like PMs will be much more mature about, looking at a piece of software running in production and knowing like how they can extract useful information from that and use it to like develop better tools. Or security, for example, will be operating more continuously. And I see that as like a trend in the next 5 to 10 years too.
I think there's a big opportunity to take, I mean, maybe I'm a little overly optimistic about this, but to take like this notion of, the repo where you used to just have the code in there, right? And then now we're talking about having the docs in there. But imagine having, you should have the analytics scripts in there that the PM is using to like drive dashboards, and you should have, of course, the design and all the front end stuff in there. But it's important to know that all that doesn't have to be. It's not like you deploy all that necessarily, right? It's like a unit of product that's like where you have all the artifacts that actually represent the product, but also the processes around the product are represented as artifacts in a single place. And it doesn't necessarily, of course, have to be one repo, but and then you use Git flow type mechanisms to then drive change around it. I think that's and to drive collaboration around it. I've seen a lot of that at Heroku, where I felt like it was almost still in its initial stages, and it has a long way to go. I know GitHub, the company itself, also is very big on that. And I'd love to see more of that. Yeah, we have 2 mechanisms that we use right now. And I guess this would be large scale debt or sort of like bigger picture stuff. One is that we maintain a risk register. So, up and down teams, I can kind of start, at the team level, but it's definitely with involvement of PM leaders, higher level engineering leaders, and so on, like really evaluating a certain risk item and then recording it, and then having a global register for all of that. And then that allows us to bubble it all the way up and allow it to influence top level priorities, which then basically creates room to go do something about it afterwards. What usually happens is like you're sitting in a corner screaming that something is like way off. But meanwhile, the marching orders are coming from far away, that you just got to keep like building features. So that's one way that we send the signals up and down so that we can like find the right place in the organization to create the space needed to address these risks. So that's one way. The other thing that we're doing is we have an operational maturity model. So at any one point in time, we have a mechanism to tell us, a methodology to tell us how healthy is a given service. That doesn't necessarily translate to us, stopping the line if there are some issues in a service. It's just still a judgment call. That gives us the data to say, okay, we have a service over here that's not where it needs to be health-wise. Healthy here means, maybe it doesn't have test coverage, maybe it doesn't have documentation, maybe it doesn't have other things right, maybe it doesn't have the right kind of performance testing, or maybe it doesn't have the right kind of scale testing. We're not really sure if it has enough scaling runway. Those are some examples of what we capture, and then we can take action based on that.
Yeah, enterpriseready.io captures a lot of them. I'll add in like on the compliance front. Compliance is infectious, so you basically have to do it. I mean, what I mean by that is like if somebody is SOC 2 compliant, they're going to require all their vendors at some level, the majority of their vendors, to be SOC 2 compliant or get exceptions for them. And so that means if you're selling to someone that is SOC 2, which is the vast majority of enterprise companies, I would wager at this point, then you need to be SOC 2 as well. So that's sort of like a necessity. I'll go out on a limb a little, and I'll point to I'll tie this into what Jesper was saying about like Git flow and like being and storing everything as code. Like that level of change management is what enterprises want from like all of the software they use. And so if you think about building towards that, you're on the right track. So for example, in Git, you can stage a change, or I mean, sorry, you can like create a pull request. So you can audit a change before it goes live. Customers want that from all of their tooling at the enterprise level, which means like approvals are a thing. And that means you need to stage multiple changes without having conflicts, and be able to have approvers in either internal or external systems accept or reject those changes. And you need to be doing that in a world where multiple collaborators are operating on a piece of data simultaneously. Git has audit logs, right? Like commit history. You need audit logs in your product. So like you know, a good analogy is like, we basically all need to build Git into our own data models, because that's what enterprises want. Like, I think what's interesting about like the blank as code movement is not the fact that actually it's stored in code, but rather that like right now we have great processes for managing change in code, and we are desperately asking for the same in all of our other tooling. And the only way we know how to get there right now is by expressing everything as code. But like, I don't think everybody really wants, you know, like your HR practices, like your HR policies encoded as code or stored in a repo necessarily. But, you know, you do want to be able to say like, what was my HR policy a year ago and how has it changed? And Git like tooling would enable you to do that.
Yeah, that is such a great point. That was something that that was a sort of a big deal for like between myself and a few other folks over at Salesforce, talking about, because we're focusing on APIs and people developing to the APIs, and then that kind of led into Apex and Visualforce and all the various ways you can develop at Salesforce. And you know, at first we looked at like the ability to like do clicks not code and be able to just like be in an interface and change everything, as that was just a great thing. It was, you know, it was only goodness, right? But as we got more and more exposed to enterprise requirements, enterprise will come back to us and say, we can't tell what changed. And then we started, and then that turned into a gigantic backlog of feature requests, right? Okay, so we need to audit when this changed, we need to audit when that changed, and so on. We started thinking about that, and as you know, being developers at you know, having a developer heart beating in us, right? We go like, we've seen this before. There's somewhere in the world where they built tools that does this really well. It's called version control, and the only requirement is that what you track is a file. Right. But that actually turns out to be a complex requirement if you build an app, if you build a system that has its own configuration sort of inside itself. So I started working with colleagues over there, like amazing, you know, product leaders and engineering leaders, on how to externalize that and how to say like, how can we express these changes that people want to make to a Salesforce configuration in files? Because if we can express it in files, then now we can externalize everything. There's a lot of good work done towards that.
Yeah, I dream of a world where there's like a SQL database where you can use in a production application that has Git-like operations attached to it, but does not.
When we became PCI compliant at Heroku, we did it through like, we were of course very Git centric already, right? And so that was more of a no-brainer. What the team did that worked on that was build all the instrumentation and integrations into Git. So whatever we needed, like, hey, we need to capture this other thing, we need to capture this other thing, we need this report to exist, we would then just build it by extracting out of GitHub what we needed, so that the workflow was always GitHub seen from a developer's perspective, and with small augmentations and small enhancements, but as little as possible. That worked beautifully.
SOC 2 we got in like year 3 or so, but now I'm seeing companies get it much earlier, right? So you have to remember, like, we started LaunchDarkly about 7 years ago, and the world has changed pretty rapidly, and now it's sort of like more table stakesy. So I'm seeing like, you know, year 1, year 2 teams get it, and like there are companies like Vanta and others that make it easier. To the question of like a broader question of like beyond compliance, like the feature set, like we're still kind of constantly working on that. Like we just launched approvals this year. Rollback is like something we didn't build into the data model, and like that's hard to retrofit in, and so we have to take the time to retrofit that in. Like as an engineering, you know, leader, I think one of the things to think about is like, it's almost like you can't overinvest in the data model even at early stages in a startup, because like you can't change that stuff very easily later. Like we had multiple iterations where we like for example, added like the idea of an organization as a layer above every entity in the data model. And it's like, that's so incredibly painful to do that migration. Just like do it up front. If you think you're going to succeed, you're going to need it. And if not, like the time required to like adjust your data model to be forward thinking is not that's not what's going to put you out of business at an early stage. I'm curious to get Jesper's take on it. I see it from many of the enterprises that we talk to that are like moving into that model, and you hear different names for it. I love holistic software development or integrated software development. Like I wish I had the Twitter following to like turn that into a real, like a movement or something, but I don't. You know, I would say like there's a bit of maybe in some of like the stodgier enterprises, there's like a cargo culting of that in the same way they cargo culted Agile, where like they say they want to be that, and then they're like, but you know, we kind of have to have them all sit separately and be in different meetings because of reasons, and then you just end up with like people paying lip service to the idea of having those integrated teams. I'd say it's like it's a trend, and I'm curious if Jesper sees that as well.
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to be really hard, honestly. I saw it at Heroku where we, you know, when we started hiring designers, so, you know, of course, originally it's just kind of the founders doing the design, and Heroku was very design oriented, just thanks to the founders. And then, first of all, that makes it big shoes to fill once you start trying to build a design team. And I hired one of the first designers that started at Heroku, and sort of, I think almost by necessity, because it was Heroku, they became very code oriented. Like everything was just happening in Git repos all the time. But then that ended up becoming, you know, a positive, or it ended up then sort of, we ended up having that integration by default. And then maybe we missed some other things, but I think the design team that grew out of that became an incredibly strong design team, and an incredibly innovative, not just in terms of the designs they created, but in terms of how they worked. You know, I know some of those people went over to GitHub and built GitHub Actions and other things after them, right? So it has definitely left a legacy. But then I look at that and go like, okay, that's going to be kind of hard to like, how do you replicate that, or how do you make that now like the norm? I think that's going to be really hard. And then design tools have evolved so much since then too. And I don't really feel I'm up to date on them either. Yeah, I don't really know where that one's going. I feel like I've seen a version of this working at some point in time. And I see the value of it, but I'm not really clear on where it's going to go.